Late winter, 1945. A muddy field somewhere behind the advancing American lines in western Germany. The kind of place that does not appear on any map. A processing camp. Wooden fences. Coiled wire. A row of canvas tents leaning against the wind. The war is almost over. Everyone there can feel it. A line of captured German soldiers shuffles forward through the slush. Their uniforms are torn. Their faces are gray. Most of them keep their eyes on their boots. Most of them. One does not. He is taller than the others. His coat is cleaner. His jaw is shaved. He walks like a man arriving at a hotel. And around his neck, something catches the light. A young American sergeant standing at the intake table sees it first. He squints. He leans forward. He sets down his pen. He begins to count. He stops. He counts again. 50. 50 small metal rectangles, looped on a single chain, hanging beneath the collar of a man who is not American, has never been American, and will never be American. The sergeant does not move. The prisoner notices him noticing, and, softly, almost politely, he smiles. Somewhere behind the tents, a field telephone begins to ring. A voice on the other end says only 4 words, "Get General Patton, now." By the early months of 1945, the German army was no longer an army. It was a collapse in motion. Whole divisions were melting into the forests. Officers were burning documents in farmhouse fireplaces. Entire SS units were stripping off their insignia and trying to disappear into the rivers of ordinary surrendering soldiers flooding westward toward the Americans, away from the Russians. The Allied processing camps could barely keep up. Thousands of prisoners arrived every day. Names were taken in pencil. Photographs were rare. Verification was almost impossible. A man could say he was a baker from Hamburg, and unless someone recognized his face, there was often no one left alive to argue. It was the perfect chaos for a monster to hide in, and the men of Patton's Third Army were starting to understand that. In the villages they liberated, they were finding things. Cellars they did not want to describe in letters home, barns no one would forget, photographs in officers' pockets that made hardened sergeants step outside the tent to be sick. Something had been changing in Patton, too. The men closest to him had noticed it for weeks. He swore less. He read more reports. He sat for long stretches with his hands folded, staring at maps he had already memorized. He was not slowing down. He was sharpening. Before we return to the camp, you need to understand who those 50 tags belong to. Not all of them. The truth is, history did not preserve every one of their stories. But a few survived. Enough to remind us what was hanging from that chain. There was a boy from Iowa. 19 years old. The kind of farm kid who could fix a tractor by listening to it. He wrote his mother every Sunday without fail, on whatever paper he could find. C-pration boxes. The back of leaflets. Once, a torn piece of a German road map. His letters always began the same way. "Ma, I'm all right." There was a newlywed from Brooklyn. Married 6 weeks before he shipped out. His wife was pregnant when he boarded the troop ship, and he carried her photograph folded inside his helmet liner because he didn't trust his pockets in the rain. There was a medic from Tennessee, 24 years old, already a veteran of 2 campaigns. He had a habit, his squad said, of humming hymns under his breath while he worked on the wounded. No one ever asked him to stop, and there was a quiet kid from Oregon. The kind nobody noticed at first. He wrote shorter letters than the others, but every single one ended with the same 6 words, "Tell Dad I'm trying my best." None of them came home the way they were supposed to. None of them were buried where their families could visit. And none of them knew that, years later, on a freezing morning in Germany, their names would be hanging from the throat of the man who had killed them. His name was Corporal James Halley, 22, Pennsylvania. He had been pulled off the front line 2 weeks earlier to help with processing because he could write quickly and he could spell. He had seen a lot. By 1945, he thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. When the tall prisoner stepped up to the intake table, Halley did what he always did. He asked for the name. He asked for the rank. He asked for the unit. The prisoner answered politely, in clean English. That was the first thing that bothered him. The second thing was the smell. Most prisoners smelled like sweat and dirt and fear. This one smelled like cologne. The third thing was the chain. Halley's pen stopped moving. He looked up. The prisoner did not flinch. He did not tuck the chain into his coat. He did not look away. Instead, slowly, almost lazily, he lifted his right hand and brushed his thumb across one of the tags, the way a man might touch a wedding ring he was proud of. Halley read the name stamped into the metal. It was an American name. He read the next one, also American. He stopped reading. He stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward into the mud. He did not pick it up. He turned, walked 10 steps away from the table, and then he ran. He ran to the command tent. He ran past 2 officers who shouted at him to slow down. He ran until he reached a field telephone, picked it up, and said 4 words that traveled 3 command posts in under 20 minutes. "Get General Patton. Now." Word moved through the camp the way smoke moves through a closed room. Patton was coming. The men who had never met him stood straighter. The men who had served under him for years did something else. They went quiet. They had seen Patton angry before. They had seen him hurl helmets across briefing rooms. They had heard him curse for a full minute without repeating himself. But the old hands, the sergeants with 3 stripes and tired eyes, they knew something the new boys didn't. When Patton stopped shouting, that was when he was most dangerous. The Jeep arrived just after 9 in the morning. It cut through a gray fog that had not lifted since dawn. Mud sprayed from its tires. The engine sounded too loud in the silence of the camp. It stopped at the gate. The driver did not get out first. A boot came down into the mud, then another. Patton stepped out without a word. He did not look at the guards who saluted him. He did not look at the officer hurrying to greet him. He looked across the field, past the tents, toward the intake line. He had already been told what was waiting for him. He began to walk. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Every man in the camp turned to watch him. Patton walked the length of the processing line without speaking. His pace was even. His hands were at his sides. His ivory-handled revolver stayed in its holster. He passed 20 prisoners, then 30, then 40. He stopped. He was standing in front of the tall one. For a long moment, he simply looked at him, not at his face, at his neck. The chain hung there in plain sight. 50 pieces of stamped American metal. 50 boys reduced to 50 rectangles. 50 mothers who did not yet know that their sons had been turned into someone else's jewelry. Patton did not touch the chain. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. The SS officer, and by now everyone in the camp understood what he was, did something that no one watching would ever forget. He smiled. It was a small smile, almost courteous, the smile of a man who believed he was, in this moment, the most interesting person in the field. The smile of a man who thought the tags around his neck made him impressive. He believed he was still in his own story. He believed he was still the dangerous one. Patton looked at him for a long time. Then he spoke. Quietly. So quietly that the men 3 rows back had to lean forward to hear him. "You think those are trophies?" The SS officer's smile did not move. "Not yet. They are not trophies." A pause. "They are boys." The smile began to falter. "And they are going home." The smile was gone. Patton did not raise his voice once. He did not call him a name. He did not threaten him. He did not promise him punishment. He simply turned his head, just slightly, toward the young officer standing at his shoulder. And he gave one instruction. "Take every tag off his neck. Verify every name. I want them in the hands of their families." He paused. "By an officer, in dress uniform, hand-delivered, not mailed." The young officer's mouth opened, then closed. Patton was already walking away. The SS officer stood in the line, still wearing the chain, suddenly aware for the first time that the story he was in was not the story he had thought. Inside the command tent, the staff officers tried, gently, to explain. This was not standard procedure. Recovered American tags were normally collected, logged, sent to a central depot, and processed through the War Department. Eventually, in time, months, sometimes longer, a form letter would reach the family. Sometimes the tag itself never made it back at all. Hand delivery by an officer in dress uniform was reserved for the formal notification of death, not for the return of recovered property. There were 50 tags, 50 families, spread across an entire continent: Iowa, Brooklyn, Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, Maine, the Carolinas. The cost in fuel, in paperwork, in officers' time would be enormous. Patton listened. He did not interrupt. When the staff finished, he picked up his pen. He signed the order. He set the pen down. He looked at no one in particular when he spoke. Those boys made it across an ocean. They can make it the rest of the way home. He stood up. He walked out. He never raised his voice once. He had spent his entire public life being remembered for the things he shouted. This was something he did without raising his voice at all. It took months. Officers in clean uniforms traveled by train, by car, by bus, by foot. They knocked on screen doors in towns most of them had never heard of. They held small envelopes in their gloved hands. Inside each envelope was a single piece of metal, polished gently, with a name stamped into it. 3 of those doors are worth standing in front of. In Iowa, a woman in an apron was hanging laundry on a line behind a white farmhouse when she saw the officer walking up the dirt road. She set down the basket. She wiped her hands on her apron, slowly, twice. She did not run to him. She did not cry out. She waited at the edge of the porch. He gave her the envelope. She opened it. She looked at the tag in her palm. For a long time, she did not move at all. She just held it. Her thumb traced the letters of her son's name. She did not cry in front of the officer. She thanked him quietly, took the tag inside, and closed the door. What happened on the other side of that door is something history is not entitled to. In Brooklyn, a young woman opened the door of a small apartment with a baby on her hip. He was 9 months old. He had his father's eyes. She had been told months earlier that her husband was not coming home. The officer stood in the hallway. He was 19 years old himself. He had rehearsed his sentence on the train, and again in the cab, and again on the staircase. He could not finish it. She saw the envelope. She saw the tag inside. She understood before he spoke. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then, very softly, she lifted the baby's small hand and placed his fingers on the metal. "This was your daddy's," she said. The officer stepped back into the hallway. He closed the door for her, because she could not. In Tennessee, an older man was sitting on a porch with a newspaper on his lap. He had not opened it. He had been holding it for nearly an hour. He watched the officer walk up the gravel path. He did not stand. He did not speak. The officer climbed the porch steps, took off his cap, and held out the envelope. The man took it. He opened it. He looked at the tag. He nodded once. He stood up. He walked into the house. The screen door closed behind him with a soft, ordinary sound. The officer stood alone on the porch for several minutes before he walked back down the path. 47 more doors. 47 more silences. 47 more names that finally came home. The man who had worn the chain was processed like any other prisoner. He was photographed. He was numbered. He was logged into a long ledger of names that filled, by the end of that spring, thousands of pages. There was no dramatic trial worth retelling. There was no final speech, no defiant last words. The records that survived describe him in 2 short lines. He had believed, standing in that line, that the tags around his neck made him someone history would have to reckon with. He was wrong. The boys whose tags he had worn would be remembered by name, in households, on mantelpieces, in framed photographs above the fireplaces of small American towns for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. He would be remembered by a number on a form. That was the punishment Patton had chosen for him, whether Patton ever said it out loud or not. Not death, not torture. Erasure. Late one night, several weeks after the camp, in a farmhouse he had taken over as a forward command post, Patton sat alone at a wooden table. A single lamp burned beside him. He was writing a letter. We do not know to whom. A young aide who passed the doorway later remembered only that the general sat very still for a long time before he began to write, and that when he finally did, he wrote slowly. Not the way he gave orders. The way a man writes when he is choosing each word. Patton was famous for advance, for speed, for forward motion, for pushing his army harder and faster than any commander in modern memory. But on that night, in that farmhouse, the man known for charging ahead was, for once, looking backward. At 50 boys, at 50 doors, at 50 mothers he would never meet, in 50 towns he would never visit, holding 50 small pieces of metal that he had personally made sure they would receive. He never spoke publicly about the tags. He did not write about them in his memoirs. He did not mention them in interviews. He did not have to. 50 families already knew. And, in the years that followed, long after the war ended, long after Patton himself was gone, the story survived the way the best stories do. Quietly. Passed from a mother to a daughter. From a widow to a son. From a father on a porch in Tennessee to a grandson who, decades later, still kept a single dog tag in a small wooden box on a shelf in his living room. That is the measure of a soldier in the end. Not how loudly he fights the enemy, but how carefully he honors the dead. We remember generals for the battles they win. But sometimes the most important thing a powerful man ever does is something no one writes down. Something he does without raising his voice. Something he does because in a single moment he understands that justice is not the same thing as revenge, and that the dead are not statistics to be filed away. 50 boys went to Europe. 50 boys did not come home the way they were supposed to. But 50 names did, carried, one at a time, by officers in clean uniforms to the doorsteps of 50 grieving families, because one general decided that a piece of metal with a name stamped into it was not a souvenir. It was a son. If you had been the officer standing on one of those 50 porches, holding the envelope, watching the door open, what would you have said when she looked up at you?